Okay, so thanks very much for having me here. Just off the top, I want to acknowledge, we have some names here, but that's just a few who contributed, or I want to acknowledge for content for the presentation and helping me work with our New York data. And specifically Jim Hoyle, who's not here today, but he's been a great mentor to me up to this point, and yeah, so thanks to everyone on there. So as Chris mentioned, I'm going to walk you through our different FCOs, or the FCO for the Nearshore. But first I just wanted to highlight the assessment that we're pulling from for this information. So primarily our GillNet. So these are the long-term assessments that New York and Ontario are doing. So our GillNet in the dark black circles are the Lake Ontario Management Unit GillNet program. The blue circle there is the warm water GillNet program. They're different in the way they're done, but we use them to compare our catches. Our trap nets are done on the Ontario side of Lake Ontario. This is a standard trap netting program that's used across the province of Ontario. We target them to use them in nearshore embayments of Lake Ontario, some of which are areas of concern as noted in red, and others are in green that are other embayments that we're interested in. And also we have angler surveys which we pull on for information. So the purple arrow is the New York Open Water Fisheries Survey in the western part of the lake. Does not extend into Eastern Basin. And then the yellow line arrow there is the Bay of Quinte Angler Survey, which has a fairly long history and more recently has extended out into Kingston Basin in Eastern Lake Ontario seasonally, so that would be in the fall. So here's our nearshore zone goal. I won't dwell on this, but what I want to get into are the different nearshore zone objectives. So 1.1, we'll start there, is to maintain a healthy, diverse fishery. So our status and trend indicator for this is to maintain or increase fisheries, populations, and recruitments of some important species such as walleye, yellow perch, northern pike, muskellunge, and bass. So for this nearshore zone objective, in some areas we're meeting the status and trend indicators, and others the results are unclear. So first I'm going to talk about walleye. So the distribution of walleye, or understanding the distribution of walleye, is very important for us to understand or to look at our assessment data. I'm going to be talking more about this afternoon if you stick around. But the kind of key message for the next couple slides is that in the Bay of Quinte, where we do gill netting and other types of assessment during the summer, that's where we see our juvenile walleye hanging out. In Kingston Basin here, where we find our adult walleye in our netting. And then during the summer as well, during our trawls, we can catch our young of year walleye for a recruitment index. So the fishery for walleye, for Ontario harvest by number, it's predominantly the rec open water fishery, followed by commercial and the rec ice, which are very similar. So it's essentially a 3-season fishery, ice fishery, 3-season open water. 66% of the effort in the Bay of Quinte open water creel was targeted towards walleye. The variation in size and age harvested is based on the season and location of those walleye. The commercial fishery on the Ontario side is highly regulated and restricted. Just over 26,000 pounds were harvested in 2018. And there is an Indigenous fishery which we do not have numbers for, but does exist. The walleye population, so as I mentioned, the juveniles in the Bay of Quinte. So the Bay of Quinte stock is I guess, recognized as this very strong stock in Lake Ontario, so that's what we're using for this assessment. The juvenile walleye, so that's in the Bay of Quinte, are meeting Ontario's Fishery Management Plan targets in our assessment GillNet. So that target is denoted by the dotted line here. And it's been hovering around that dotted line for quite some time, so showing a strong, stable trend. And in 2018, the year class strength was dominated by age 2, 3, and 4-year-olds, and they were exceptionally abundant as when we look back to previous years. So our adult population of walleye, again, this is a similar graph. So this is our catch per unit gill net in Eastern Lake Ontario from low-use gill netting. The dotted line represents Fisheries Management Plan targets, and then we can see there's a trend, an increasing trend in exceeding current targets. If we look at the age structure for the most recent year, 2018, we see many age classes present, Again, we wouldn't expect to see these juvenile in this gill netting, but this is great to see a good number of year classes. In New York, we see a lower catch per unit effort, so a mean between 2009 and 2018 was 1.8, but they show a stable trend. We don't show this here. So recruitment, so this is age 0 walleye. Again, this is our fishery management plan targets. Catch per unit trawl is on the y-axis, year class on the x. And we can see in 2018, this is classified as a good year class. This was following 2 relatively fair poor week classes, so this is really great to see. So overall, walleye is doing quite well in our assessment. So moving to yellow perch, the distribution I'm talking about here for the next few slides is Bay of Quinte and Eastern Basin. So the fishery is comprised of commercial in New York and Ontario. So the commercial New York fishery is relatively small, but it's dominated by yellow perch, so almost 100%. Just under 40,000 pounds was harvested last year, but this is a decline of 42% from 2017. Similarly, in Lake Ontario, there's a commercial fishery, almost 30% by weight. Just under 100,000 pounds was harvested. That's a 45% decline from 2017. So a couple of reasons for that. One, the market was really bad last year for yellow perch fishers, but the effort was really low. And if you can see on the right-hand side here, the harvest per unit effort was very low as well, or not very low, but lower than last year. So we saw a decline in effort as well as a decline in harvest per unit effort from our fishers. There's also a recreational fishery in the Bay of Quinte in eastern Lake Ontario. It's a relatively low targeted effort. In 2017, we estimated that at about 6%, and a lot of the catch is actually bycatch from those folks targeting walleye. But we also see a decline in lake-wide catches from New York State fishing boat surveys. There's also a significant fishery on Lake St. Francis, which I don't present here, and that was about a 45% targeted effort in 2018, but we did see a decline in that fishery as well. So looking at our population metrics, we have gill net catch per unit effort from Ontario gill nets as well as New York. So in our Ontario gill nets, we see a declining trend. So this is a contemporary time series from about 1993 onwards. So here we see a declining trend in Ontario. We see an increasing trend in New York gill nets since 1992, with some low catches observed in this time series, potentially due to below average summer temperatures and potentially just low detection or catches. So in 2018, at both of our surveys, we saw a decline, but the overall assessment is mixed. Moving to smallmouth bass, so the information I'm using for this is our information from our gill net in our Eastern Basin from New York, as well as the Rec Angler Survey, and we do have some tournament information as well. So smallmouth bass provides an important recreational fishery in Lake Ontario. There's no current data on the Eastern Basin angler catch, but there is a survey New York is planning for 2020. But here we can see the catch rate for bass, so bass per angler hour for that lake-wide survey. And we can see we had an increase during this time period, a decline to records low, I believe that's 2010, of 0.35 catch per angler hour. We do see an increasing trend though more recently, and in 2018 we had a catch of 0.86, and I'd say the consensus is that's on par with what we're seeing in Lake Erie. So bass tournaments are another area we can look at for smallmouth fishery. So this information, Bruce Tufts from Queen's University goes out and samples these bass tournaments. So information he provided shows us that they sampled about 33 tournaments last year, and just about 12,000 fish were weighed in. And this varied across the season and geographical location, as noted here. These are different weigh-in stations for different tournaments they sampled. But he stressed that many more are caught throughout the tournaments, and these are the largest and oldest fishes of the population. And we also note here that through his tournament sampling that the number of actual tournaments is increasing, and it has increased in 2018. So if we look at the population of smallmouth bass, We see a smallmouth vary without trend since the mid-1990s in eastern Lake Ontario, and this is from the New York Index gill nets. And we have relatively low abundance in Lake Ontario waters, so that's not shown here, but relatively stable. So our next FCO is 1.2, so this is to restore lake sturgeon populations. Here we have two restoration indicators, which today I don't really have the time to get into, but I did want to bring everyone's attention to the recently published New York DEC draft lake sturgeon population assessment report. And here we can see in yellow some areas that may be of interest to us. Some take-home messages here are that in Western Lake Ontario, we're seeing that it meets the metrics for delisting. In Eastern Lake Ontario, though, we have not, so that's shown here, with some more data needed and perhaps a positive trend. Of note in 2018, 2,250 small fingerlings were stocked in Chameau Bay, and these were tagged and marked as well. So that just goes towards some efforts of reintroducing those sturgeon. Our next FCO is 1.3, so that's to restore American eel abundance. We have two restoration indicators here. Tom Pratt from DFO is presenting right after me, so I won't spend any time on this. I'm sure you'll see some of these main bullets and figures during his presentation. But the message here is that we're not meeting this FCO at that time. But there's lots of effort and research into safe downstream passage, and that seems to be continuing. Okay, so our last FCO 1.4, this is to maintain and restore native fish communities. And our status and trend indicator is to maintain and restore native fish species richness and diversity in nearshore areas and in bayments. So here we see some positive trends of beating that FCO, and then some questions as well. So the first piece of information I'd like to pull on is our Index of Biologic Integrity. So as I mentioned at the beginning, Ontario does trap nettings and embayments on the North Shore of Lake Ontario in a variety of areas. We call this the Niskin program, if you're familiar. So in some areas we do them in sheltered, and some areas are exposed. But generally here, we use it as a metrics to essentially evaluate and compare ecosystem health. So this is an IBI score, and essentially higher IBI values represent greater native species richness, abundance, and biomass. So this figure here shows the different embayments that we've sampled between 2006 and 2018. IBI scores are on the left-hand side, and on the right, these are the classifications which they fall into, so very poor up to excellent. I've broken this into 2 time periods just to show a bit of a temporal trend here, 2006 to 13 and 2014 to 2018. So we can see in some areas we don't see much change in those IBI indexes. For example, Wellers Bay, Westlake. Upper Bay of Quinte being our long-term time series that we do annually. In some areas we see an increase in IBI scores, such as Hamilton Harbour, which I'll be talking about in the next couple slides, where we're working on restoring walleye populations there, as well as Presqu'île Bay and Prince Edward Bay. And on other areas, though, we have seen a decline, Toronto Harbour being one of those, and one of the lowest IBI scores we have as well. So some good news stories here and some other questions. So as I mentioned, in Hamilton Harbour, we're working on restoring walleye populations. So here, this is an effort that we're working on at our unit, collecting walleye from the Bay of Quinte, producing hatchery stocked fish, which we then are stocking in Hamilton Harbour. So in 2012, just a very brief history of this program and some early signs of success. In 2012, 100,000 summer fingerlings were stocked, so that's Colin Lake, one of our biologists doing that here. In September 2012, our partners at DFO were already catching those fish that were stocked in the summer there, so they would have been this size when they were stocked. In 2015, it was a great ice year, and Hamilton Harbour saw some increase in angler activity and catches of walleye in the bay, which hadn't been there for a while, so you can imagine there's a lot of excitement there for folks. And most recently in 2018, we were there assessing with our trap nets, and we were seeing those age classes showing up in our assessment. So again, this 2012 year class, on the right-hand side, this is our age structure for our trap netting program from 2014 to 2018. We weren't there in 2017, but as you can see, circled in red is that year class kind of chugging through the time series. So the 2012 is really the most successful stocking event we've seen to date, even though we had previous stocking attempts after that. In 2016, though, however, just over 100,000 fall fingerlings or summer fingerlings were stocked again. 2018 would have been the first year we would see those in our assessment, and we were happy to detect them, although not as high as detection as that 2012 year class. So early signs for success for the restoration of walleye in Hamilton Harbour. Going on at the same time, DFO is doing some really cool and exciting acoustic telemetry work. I encourage you to check out Jill Brooks' recently published paper on the spatial ecology of the reintroduced walleye in this area. And they're doing lots of other works around trying to figure out where they're spawning, and I think this spring perhaps looking for early sign of spawning success. However, with regards to nearshore native fish communities, we're concerned about invasive species, and this afternoon I'll be talking to you about a new invader, the tench, which was detected in the Bay of Quinte this summer. So again, that's not a good sign, and that's something that we're always surveilling and looking out for. So with that, just to summarize, we've got some good signs for our nearshore fish communities within 1.1, 1.2, and 1.4. And some other questionable areas within our 1.1 and 1.4. And with that, I'll take any questions. I think I have a couple moments, so thank you.